I didn't know which was scarier, evil clown or continental philosophy, so I just went with both. So, welcome. It's getting to be one of my favorite times of year, getting close to Halloween, and it's been a while since I added to my series on What is Philosophy by Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. Had quite a few people ask me when I'm going to get back to it, and long story short is I'm getting back to it now, and I think hopefully it's an appropriate time to get back into it because at the end of the last talk on What is Philosophy, I ended with a quote from Gilles Deleuze, and that quote was, "To need a concept means having something to scream." So I thought it was appropriate that in the month of October, when we are watching scary flicks and seeing all kinds of scary decorations and things like that, why not take a look at this enigmatic quote from Gilles Deleuze on screaming and how it relates to philosophy. So when I introduced the quote from Deleuze, up to that point, we had primarily been focusing on philosophy's value, what makes philosophy valuable. And this had something to do with the concepts philosophers come up with and how those concepts connect to problems that we presumably could face in our lives. With this quote saying that philosophy is, first of all, something that we need, Deleuze is pushing us another step further. He's going beyond just saying that philosophy is valuable. He's actually telling us it's necessary. Not only that, but he's telling us that this necessity, this need for concepts, for philosophy, is actually something that we can feel. There is something that arises within us when we lack a concept, when we're in need of philosophy. And he compares this feeling to that of having something to scream. And so behind this rather mysterious quip from Deleuze, I think there is a somewhat striking claim, which is that philosophy is much more than just some ivory tower indulgence. Rather, it's something that we all benefit from. It's something we all need. And this is a striking claim because it's not something everyone would agree with. Not even all philosophers would agree with it, especially in the last, 20 or 30 years, especially. You're starting to see more and more philosophers, as well as non-philosophers, kind of wonder if philosophy is actually necessary. Like, do we really need this discipline anymore? Some people think that most of the questions philosophers have asked have already been answered, and the ones that remain are probably best left to disciplines that are more rigorous, like science or something like that. If you've seen my video on Chris Daly's article about the need to replace philosophy with science, you'll see that this is very much a contemporary issue that is brought up even by philosophers themselves. If Deleuze is right, though, if concepts are something that we need, then perhaps we shouldn't be so quick to close the book on philosophy. So let's take a look at what Deleuze has to say about philosophy, concepts, and the need for a good scream every now and then. So in 1980, Gilles Deleuze was giving a lecture on a philosopher named Gottfried Leibniz, and we will actually see, we'll be revisiting Leibniz in chapter 1, possibly in the next talk. The name of this lecture was Leibniz, Philosophy and the Formation of Concepts. Seems appropriate, at least the subtitle of that lecture is kind of what we've been talking about since day one, because that's what philosophy is for Deleuze and Guattari. And keep in mind, I think I've mentioned this before, that this idea of philosophy as the art of forming concepts is itself an idea that Deleuze had been fleshing out for a while before he sat down with Guattari and wrote What is Philosophy. So this lecture is from 1980. What is Philosophy came out in 91. So like a decade earlier, we're already seeing Deleuze exploring this idea of philosophy as the art of forming concepts. Now, in characteristic fashion, just as he does in his writing, maybe perhaps more so even, Deleuze goes off on a number of tangents in this lecture. He goes down all kinds of different avenues that sort of don't appear to relate directly to the original topic, which was a specific philosopher, Leibniz in this case. But that's part of what makes Deleuze interesting and challenging to read, maybe more so in his lectures when he's actually just kind of thinking out loud to some degree. So there is a selection from this lecture that I thought was interesting to look at, and that's where I'm taking this quote about the need for concepts and the need to scream. So here's the quote that I'm referring to. In some ways, the philosopher is not someone who sings, but someone who screams. And what does he or she scream? Each time that you need to scream, this isn't always from pain, it could be from anger, it could be, he kind of trails off there. I think that you are not far from a kind of call of philosophy. What would it mean for the concept to be a kind of scream, or a kind of form of scream? That's what it means to need a concept. To need a concept means having something to scream. What can one have to scream? It could be many things, many things. So what would the scream be? You think, well, I'm not going there. It's just so that one can scream, in fact. That can be Deleuze attempts to wail. I guess Deleuze was giving an example of screaming. That must have been interesting, to be sitting in a classroom and having the professor screaming. There you don't have a concept. Precisely to find the concept of that scream, there you are perhaps doing philosophy. But so fine, to cry, one can scream thousands of things. Imagine someone who screams, well, really, all that must have some kind of reason to be. It's a very simple scream. In my definition, the concept is the form of the scream. We immediately see a series of philosophers who would say, yes, yes. I am thinking of some philosophers, precisely philosophers of passion, philosophers of pathos, in contrast from philosophers of logos. For example, Kierkegaard based his entire philosophy on some fundamental screams. Now, before I get right into the central quote, the need to scream, the having something to scream, just a quick note, I think, on Deleuze's lectures, because we've looked at some secondary sources from Deleuze in this series, but those have been primarily texts or interviews. And Deleuze's lectures, I think, are very similar to the way he writes, but they're kind of just like magnified. You know, like Deleuze, especially his collaborative works with Guattari, like when the two of them get together, it's like all bets are off. You never know where they're going to take you. Part of what Deleuze is doing when he lectures is he's doing much more than talking about philosophy. He's actually conducting philosophy. He's this thinking out loud, this stream of consciousness thing that I think is pretty apparent in just reading this short section from one of his lectures. I think this serves a purpose. I don't believe it is just he's not great at speaking. I don't think that's true. Deleuze is a good speaker because he's kind of trying to show you what philosophy is supposed to look like when it's being done. It's supposed to be this like experimental thing, right? Because for Deleuze, everything is in flux. Philosophy is not something that is already made and it's just a matter of finding it or uncovering it. It's something that emerges. It grows out of this like organic process. There's always something new around every corner. So when Deleuze is lecturing, I would imagine he's probably not standing still, much like he doesn't think philosophy just stands still. He's probably strolling around, quickening his pace when he gets inspired, and every so often stumbling onto something that maybe he didn't realize he was looking for. So by equating the need for a concept, like a philosophical concept, with the need to scream, I think Deleuze is implying that whenever we lack a concept, it corresponds to a particular feeling. It's something that we feel when we're in need of a concept, and as it's being described here, it seems to be a feeling that's kind of uncomfortable or uneasy. So just as we might scream and respond to something that is frightening, like evil clown mask or a spider, if you're afraid of spiders like I am, or if we're experiencing some kind of internal pain, or so it could even be something cognitive, like when you, if you've ever had like a word on the tip of your tongue that you know is there, but you just can't think of what the word is. This experience itself produces a kind of tension, a kind of discomfort. And Deleuze seems to think that the same tension, the same discomfort arises when we lack a concept to describe something we're thinking about or trying to arrive at. Now, it's really, really important to note that Deleuze doesn't say the need for a concept is to scream. So when we need a concept, he's not saying that that is the same thing as screaming. We're actually one step before that. He says it means having something to scream. So what does it mean to have something to scream? Well, I think it probably means something like, if I told you I have something to say, right? Necessarily, I have not yet said it. Whatever it is I have to say has not yet been said. It wouldn't make sense for me to say something and then tell you I have something to say, and you ask me, what is it? And I tell you, well, it's what I've already said. That wouldn't really make sense. So it's this feeling that comes before we actually have, for lack of a better word, the right word to describe what we're trying to talk about. When we're in this state where we're in need of a concept and we have something to say or something to scream, as Deleuze puts it, it's like we're in this moment where we can only express this idea or this sentiment in a very raw form, something very pure and primordial, but ultimately still in need of being decoded. So it's kind of like when an infant cries, it's part of mom or dad's job to decode what the infant wants. Is it hungry? Does it just want to be held? Etc. The point is that philosophy's job, or at least part of its job, is to resolve these kinds of tensions where we're in need of a way to express something meaningfully. We need concepts because if we can't conceptualize a problem, for example, it's kind of hard to address the problem. It's kind of like if you know you're sick, but you don't know what you have, you don't know what kind of medicine to take. Might be one way of looking at it. And this in and of itself is a problem. And as I think we'll see, it's kind of like the fundamental problem of philosophy. This actually happened to me rather recently, where I was in need of a concept. I had something to scream. I had something to express, but I lacked the vocabulary to do so. I had a number of disparate components that I couldn't put together into one concept. This happened while I was working on a video that I put out maybe a few weeks ago, where I was trying to analyze someone else's argument. In fact, a number of arguments that someone else was making in their work. And I noticed a pattern in the way their arguments were structured, but I didn't know what to call it. I had all these like creative ways that I was trying to express it, and I was sharing this with peers of mine, other philosophers, and I was trying to solicit suggestions on like what to call this strange logic. That was sort of like the I'm experiencing it right now. I'm trying to that was the placeholder, right? That was the placeholder. And as I was searching for the word placeholder, right, I was experiencing that need to scream. Not literally scream at the top of my lungs, but you get the point. The thing about this need to scream thing, if it's not already clear, is that it's actually very, very simple. It's really not as complicated as pretty much everything else Deleuze has to say. But in any case, with this video that I was trying to come up with a term to describe the logical structure of my interlocutor's arguments, I eventually found a list of logical fallacies, and there's always, like, every time I look into logical fallacies, there's always ones that I didn't even know existed. And I came across this concept of something called kettle logic. And kettle logic is basically when you have an argument whose premises actually end up contradicting each other. And that's exactly what was happening in my interlocutor's argument. And I didn't even know there was already a word for that. So I didn't have to come up with something new. And I actually really, really loved the story behind the term kettle logic, which you can look into if you're interested. It comes from Freud, actually. Freud and Derrida. So quite an interesting journey the concept had through a number of thinkers. But in any case, when I stumbled across this concept, this term, kettle logic, and I had a word to express what I was perceiving in the other person's argument structure, I had this moment where I was like, so like relieved. Like I felt like an actual release, like in my chest, because I was starting to get really stressed out about it. I was starting to get worried that I wasn't going to have like a nice, crisp, concise notion to attach and kind of encapsulate all these disparate elements that I was seeing in their arguments. And when I found this kettle logic concept, I felt like I had something to give form to it. I had a word that I could use to express what I was trying to say. And this happens like constantly. This is just like the most recent example I can think of. But this happens all the time. And the image that comes to mind for me in regards to this needing to scream, this needing to have a concept, I think of, it might sound a little corny, but I actually think of a recurring scene in the Peanuts comics where Charlie Brown goes to Lucy when she's doing her psychiatry booth, and he gives her all these problems he has, and she gives him all this kind of meaningless advice. And there's one in particular where she's trying to diagnose his fears. And she gives him all these weird, like, obscure fears and phobias. And he says, no, that's not it. That's not it. And then she finally says, you must have, I forget what the word is, but she says, you must have the fear of everything. And Charlie Brown gets all excited and he screams, that's it. And then Lucy kind of somersaults in the air because he yells so loudly. I have these that's it moments all the time in philosophy. I think most writers and readers of philosophy experience this from time to time. I say readers of philosophy because part of the reason I think we do read philosophy is because we're hoping to find somebody else who can put into words what we feel and think. While it's definitely worthwhile to work on self-expression, that's certainly important, we've got to start somewhere, right? I mean, Deleuze mentioned Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard put word and form to a lot of feelings I had when I first started getting into philosophy. He was able to put things into words that I didn't even know I was trying to express. So this idea of philosophy's function as giving voice to this primordial impulse to scream inside of us when we're trying to express something, we're trying to communicate meaningfully with others. I think Deleuze has really touched on something really important about philosophy with this. And that's why I love this quote so much. It's not just reading philosophy, though. It's not just about picking up a philosophy book and just following whatever is said. Not only do I think that that is not what philosophy is for, that's just dogma, basically. It's also not what Deleuze and Guattari think philosophy is for. I think from the very first video in this series, I talked about how for Deleuze and Guattari, the idea of blindly accepting what's already been written is kind of off the table. We're interested in creating something new. And creating new things, if you're following Deleuze's example, usually involves a little bit of destruction. So, in order to escape the chaos, sometimes we do need to stir the pot up a little bit, would be one way of putting it. That's what makes Deleuze such a great philosopher to read, though. The weird thing about this is that Deleuze's scream itself is a concept. And it's such a valuable concept because it's giving form to the feeling of not being able to give form to something. I mean, this is like Deleuze at the furthest reaches of metaphilosophy at this point. And yet at the same time, it's almost the opposite. It's Deleuze dropping down into the very mundane, everyday phenomena of human existence. Because with Deleuze's scream, he is giving form to something that everyone experiences in their lives. Whether you're a philosopher, a writer, or a reader, or you don't think much about philosophy at all, everybody goes through that experience of not having a way of expressing what they're trying to say. They might not even know what it is they're trying to say, but they know that they have something. They know they have something to scream. And so I think just by giving voice to that feeling itself, Deleuze has equipped us with something that is highly versatile, really impactful, and very helpful in navigating his work as well as philosophy in general. I hope you've enjoyed this. Let me know in the comments below, what are some examples you can think of where philosophy, whether it's reading it or writing it, has helped you to give voice to something that otherwise you were struggling to express. Maybe that would be helpful for others to hear more examples of this need to scream and how philosophy can resolve that tension. Hope you've enjoyed this. Hope you're enjoying this series. Again, sorry it's taken me so long to add to it. I'm going to try and do my best to work through more of this book, because I always enjoy Deleuze. As much as he challenges me and sometimes makes me want to scream, I do enjoy him. Thanks.